seminars, freedom schools. The more they studied, the more they realized how fast communism was advancing on all fronts. They also learned to their amazement that most Washington politicians were doing practically nothing about it. In fact, in many cases, they were doing things to promote communism. So the protests began to pour into the national capital from every state in the Union. All over America, there was an awakening. The Soviet leaders knew this trend could create a crisis for communism, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. Therefore, they called together communist delegates from 81 countries and held a meeting in Moscow. In December 1960, just 5 years ago, this communist convention issued an edict that the rising tide of patriotism and anti-communism must be smashed, especially in the United States. All the tricks of hate propaganda and smear tactics were to be unleashed on the heads of American patriots. Now, if the communists had been forced to do this job themselves, it would have been an utter failure. Americans would have simply closed ranks and united. But what mixes so many people up is the fact that the attack on patriotism and the smear of the anti-communist movement did not come in the name of Moscow. It came in the name of influential Americans who espoused the socialist communist line. This was a minority bloc of liberals, American liberals, who formed a propaganda coalition with the communists. Their strategy was ingenious. Almost overnight, they drew the line of fire away from the communist conspiracy and focused the heat of attack on the patriots. How did they do it? They did it by saying that they were against the communists, but also against the anti-communists. They said one was as bad as the other. Now, what kind of logic was this? What if we had taken this approach in the fight against Nazism? Informed patriots recognized it as confusion compounded by delusion. In any event, this deceptive line of propaganda had its impact. These liberal voices would denounce communism and then turn right around and parrot the communist line. They claimed they were anti-communist, but spent most of their time fighting those who were really effective anti-communists. As I asked some of them at the time, "Are you fighting the communists or not? You claim to be fighting the fire, but you spend nearly all your time fighting the firemen." By 1962, these American liberals had almost completely neutralized the resurgence of American patriotism. They had frightened uninformed citizens away from study groups and patriotic rallies. They had made it popular to call patriotism a controversial subject, which should not be discussed in school assemblies or churches. From Washington, D.C., the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, issued an edict to radio and television stations that if they allowed the controversial subjects of Americanism, anti-communism, or states' rights to be discussed on their stations, they would be required to give equal time free of charge to anyone wishing to present an opposite view. Can you imagine this happening in a free country? I said to my family, "It is fantastic that anything like this could have happened in America." Now, we should all be opposed to socialistic communism, for it is our mortal and spiritual enemy, the greatest evil in the world today. But the reason many liberals don't want the American people to form study groups, to really understand and then fight socialistic communism, is that once the American people get the facts, they will begin to realize that much of what these liberals advocate is actually helping the enemy. The liberals hope you'll believe them when they tell you how anti-communist they are. But they become alarmed if you really inform yourself on the subject of socialistic communism. For after you inform yourself, you might begin to study the liberal voting record. And this study would show you how much the liberals are giving aid and comfort to the enemy, and how much the liberals are actually leading America towards socialism itself. For communism is just another form of socialism, as is fascism. So now you can see the picture. These liberals want you to know how much they are doing for you, with your tax money, of course, but they don't want you to realize that the path they are pursuing is socialistic, and that socialism is the same as communism in its ultimate effect on our liberties. When you point this out, they want to shut you up. They accuse you of maligning them, of casting aspersions, of being political. No matter whether they label their bottle as liberalism, progressivism, or social reform, I know the contents of the bottle is poison to this republic, and I'm going to call it poison. We do not need to question the motive of these liberals. They could be most sincere. But sincerity, or supposed benevolence, or even cleverness is not the question. The question is, are we going to save this country from the hands of the enemy and the deceived? As J. Edgar Hoover said, a tragedy of the past generation in the United States is that so many persons, including high-ranking statesmen, public officials, educators, ministers of the gospel, professional men, have been duped into helping communism. Communist leaders have proclaimed that communism must be partly built with non-communist hands, and this, to a large extent, is true. We cannot defeat communism with socialism, nor with secularism, nor with pacifism, nor with appeasement or accommodation. We can only defeat communism with true Americanism, unquote. So from the very beginning of this Moscow campaign to stop the anti-communist movement in this country, it was an important part of the communist strategy to get their liberal American friends to carry out an attack against patriotic organizations. Of course, the communists have learned not to attack all patriotic groups at once. Their strategy is to focus on just one organization and make it so detestable and ugly in the public mind that they can hold it up as a sort of tar baby and then use it to smear all other individuals or groups in the same category. It was interesting to see just where the communists would begin their dirty work. Which organization would be singled out to get the tar brush treatment? It could have been the American Farm Bureau, which the communists have consistently denounced. It could have been the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars, the DAR, the Sons of the American Revolution. These have been favorite communist targets in the past, as had J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. As it turned out, it was none of these. Instead, the communists chose to focus their attack on a fairly new organization, which very few people had heard about, including myself. They decided to level practically their entire arsenal on the John Birch Society. For the non-political Birch Society had within it both the policy, the program, and the personnel to help defeat the conspiracy in this country. And the communists knew it, for they had seen its results. On